Welcome to episode 4. This episode focuses on something that often feels much bigger than students expect: the literature review. One pattern that still surprises me is how many students initially think the literature review is simply a very large reading exercise. In reality, it is something much more important. It is where you begin to establish your position within a scholarly conversation. This episode is about understanding that shift. And before we begin, let's briefly look back. This slide reminds us where we've come from. A good research question creates a destination. The literature review helps you understand the landscape around it. I quite like this analogy because the research question tells you where you're going, but the literature review tells you what already exists around that destination. Who has already travelled there? Who disagrees? What remains unresolved? And that naturally brings us to where many students currently find themselves. This slide captures a very common misunderstanding. Many students believe reading enough papers is the same as conducting a literature review. It is not. I've lost count of the number of times students have proudly told me I've read 250 papers. My response is usually very simple. What have you learned from them? Because reading alone is not the objective. And that leads directly to the biggest misunderstanding. This slide contains one of the most important ideas in the episode. A literature review is not a summary of papers. It is an argument. That single sentence changes everything. I remember one student who submitted 80 pages of beautifully written summaries. Unfortunately, there was almost no argument. Everything was described. Nothing was connected. The literature review is not asking, what did everybody say? It is asking, what does all of this collectively mean? And once we understand that, another idea becomes important. You are joining a conversation. This slide introduces a sequence that I think students often underestimate. First listen, then understand, then contribute. The order matters. One thing I wish more students understood is that contribution rarely happens immediately. At first, your role is to listen carefully. Then patterns begin to emerge. Only then do you gradually begin contributing your own perspective. And that naturally changes how we think about reading. This slide contains another important message. Reading supports thinking. It is not a substitute for thinking. I've lost count of the number of times students have mistaken activity for progress. Reading can become very comfortable because reading feels productive. Thinking often feels uncomfortable because thinking requires decisions. And doctoral study repeatedly asks you to make a decision. Which brings us to a very important question. What exactly are you looking for when you read? This slide introduces 3 excellent questions. What do we know? What do we disagree about? What remains uncertain? I would encourage you to keep these questions beside you wherever you read. One pattern that still surprises me is how much clarity these simple questions create, because suddenly reading becomes purposeful. You stop collecting information and start identifying patterns. And that naturally brings us to significance. This slide builds beautifully on what we discussed in episode 3. Important problems matter more than simply finding gaps. I've become increasingly convinced that significance is one of the most misunderstood concepts in doctoral education. Students often become obsessed with finding an empty space, but empty spaces are not always important. Instead, ask yourself, why should anybody care if this problem is solved? That single question often sharpens thinking enormously. And once significance becomes clearer, another layer begins to emerge, your conceptual lens. This slide introduces several important ideas: concepts, theories, assumptions, perspectives. One thing I wish more students understood is that these are not obstacles to overcome. They are tools to help you think. I remember one candidate who kept saying, "There are too many theories." Eventually I said, "You don't need every theory. You need the theories that help explain your problem." That immediately reduced their anxiety. And speaking of anxiety, we need to talk about the human reality. I think this slide may be one of the most important in the episode. Information overload, confusion, self-doubt, all are common. I've become less certain that confusion is a problem. I've become more certain that confusion often means deeper learning is beginning. Because if you're reading conflicting evidence, uncertainty is often unavoidable. And when uncertainty increases, certain mistakes often begin to appear. This slide introduces several traps: summarizing instead of analyzing, describing instead of evaluating, avoiding decisions. I've seen all three many times. Perhaps the most common is avoiding decisions. Students often think they need to read more before they can commit to a position. Sometimes the opposite is true. Taking a position helps you know what to read next, and that eventually leads us to something very important: your voice. I think this may be my favourite slide in this episode. The question becomes, what do I think this evidence means? Notice how powerful that shift is. You are no longer simply reporting, you're interpreting. I remember one student saying, "I don't think I know enough to have an opinion." My response was simple. Doctoral study is partly about learning how to develop informed opinions. Your voice does not arrive overnight. It develops gradually, and perhaps that is why the reflection questions matter so much. This slide asks two excellent questions. Am I collecting information or building an argument? Where do I stand in the debate? I would encourage you to revisit these regularly, because literature reviews are ultimately exercises in intellectual positioning. And speaking of positioning, let's briefly look ahead. This slide introduces episode 5, developing the research proposal. One pattern that still surprises me is how often students think proposals are simply administrative documents. In reality, proposals are early demonstrations of intellectual judgment. Episode 5 will explore that idea in much more detail. But before we finish, let's briefly acknowledge the references. This slide introduces some excellent resources. These texts explain how strong literature reviews are constructed. I would encourage you to use them not as instruction manuals, but as thinking partners. And we have one final reference slide before we conclude. This slide continues those recommendations. One thing I particularly like about these authors is that they all encourage critical engagement rather than passive reading. And critical engagement is really what this episode has been about from the beginning. Which brings us to our final slide. Thank you for joining me for episode 4. If there's one idea I would like you to remember, it is this. The literature review is not a test of how much you can read. It is a process of learning how to think, evaluate, and position yourself within a scholarly conversation. And that may be one of the biggest transitions you make during your entire doctorate. I look forward to seeing you in episode 5.